Hey guys, today is the patch 10.10. I've played a few games, I've played a variety of compositions, I've also seen how other people have done with their compositions, and I've decided to put out a tier list for comps, which I think is going to be moderately accurate. Again, might not be the case, but what is most important is that I'm basically putting all of the comps in one place, and I've got timestamps in the description, so go to the description, look at the tier list that I've got sorted in the description, and feel free to click on a link and it will take you to the comp on Mobalytics. You can copy the comp there. Not doing early mid game because it's going to take too long for every comp. I'm trying to include as many comps as possible. So the way this video is going to go down, patch breakdown, which you can skip if you want to, talking about comps, and we're going to have all the different comps listed in a tier list, and the tier list is going to go from S to B to C. Okay, so I've got my S at the start, my C at the end, and you'll find them all in the description below. Also, thanks to G2A for sponsoring the channel. The ref link is in the description below if you want it. Cheers. I will get on with the patch notes now. Hey everyone, 8:30 in the morning, patch 10.10 is out in EU anyway, and we are going to talk about the Teamfight Tactics patch highlights. For general, Super Dense Galaxy now grants a free Force of Nature after Stage 3 Carousel rather than upon reaching level 5, which is great because after the Stage 2 Carousel, people would go to level 5, and then if you didn't level to level 5 because you were trying to play a Hyper Roll comp, which are dead this patch really, not dead, but they're not as good, or you were just trying to eco, you would get hit really hard because you'd be going up against boards that had 2 extra units on them. If you attempt to use Nico's helps, this is a good change in general. If you attempt to use Nico's on a unit with no copies left in the shop, you'll see an error message. Basically, this would only be the case for either legendaries, so 5 costs, or people trying to 3-star or 4 cost. If all of them had been bought out, you'd see why you couldn't copy it, and that's essentially why that's happened. Reduce the chances of finding a random full item carousel by a large amount, especially in earlier carousels. Thank the Lord, those random full item carousels were a complete nightmare. They completely screwed your game plan a lot of the time, which I think, I like the fact that you adapted to it, but it was really just, I think it was an unfun way to deal with the early game. I don't mind it in later carousels, of course. Item drops are now a bit more likely to appear in earlier PvE stages. So what happens in TFT is that the items are generally spread out across all of the PvE rounds, and most people will end up getting about the same number of components across the game. Now they're shifting it so that you get them more likely in the early game, which is great because it's going to allow you to have more item options. New Armory, Galactic Armory, all players start with the same 2 full items. Going to be a really interesting one because if you get like perfect Kayle items, for instance, everybody's going to want to go Kayle, so it's about learning to adapt. Do you go and compete for Kayle or with just the perfect items, or do you use those items elsewhere? And it's changed the Galaxy odds with Treasure Trove, Trade Sector, and Galactic Armory being the most likely out of the special ones, which I think most people would like. Because I think Treasure Trove is everyone's favourite galaxy. So it's my favourite galaxy. I know it's a lot of streamers' favourite galaxy as well, just because you get so many item options. Mech Pilot attack damage, 100% of... sorry, 1 second. It's quite early. 100% of pilot's attack damage to 80 plus 45% of a pilot's attack damage. Now, I actually went and had a look at some maths behind this, and someone had done some maths on Reddit about it. This is basically a nerf from the get-go. It's not even a nerf, a buff early game and a nerf late game. This is a full-on nerf. In the late game, the mech has 30% or there or thereabouts less attack damage, which is insane. Look, end of the day, mech is mech. With the right items, mech is mech. And if you get like a demo spat Kaiser and your mech's there, you're probably still going to be fine. But Morello's getting nerfed, mech's getting nerfed. And that's actually pretty insane. Mech infiltrators now jump regardless if there is a target within an attack range at the start of combat. This is only a big change, I would say, for people like Infiltrator Kayle. You know when you're trying to play Infiltrator Kayle or an Infiltrator range champion because you're using the Infiltrator spat for something. This is going to mean that Kayle jumps to the back line regardless of what happens, which actually can be quite dangerous, so you've got to think about that. And Space Pirates get a buff. No one plays Space Pirates seriously because... Again, you need a gangplank, and the problem with needing a gangplank is that it's like a level 8 build, and you can't, unless you're playing Space Jam and you're just randomly keeping a Graves around, and then you transition into Space Jam with 4 pirates, cool, but otherwise not really worth it. Nerfs to specific champions. Poppy Buckler toss damage has been nerfed in terms of flat scaling, and the shield has been nerfed in terms of flat scaling. I don't even know if that really hugely impacts Poppy, to be honest with you. I know Poppy gets nerfed here, but I genuinely feel Poppy's still going to be fine. Genuinely still think Poppy will be fine. I think you can play Poppy Hyper Roll. I don't think the scaling was the issue. Sorry, the flat damage was the issue. I think it was the scaling with sorcerers. The scaling will be down significantly, but not as much as I think you think it's going to be. So it's still going to have a good shield. Twisted Fate's getting nerfed pretty heavily in the late game. So Twisted Fate 3, no longer as good of a carry. So he's going to be hit. He's actually one of the secondary carries for this comp, so that's pretty hard. So the Poppy comp in general has gone down in power, for sure. Xayah AD down by 5. Now, you might think, well, that's only 5, but what actually happens is that when they level up, they scale based off their initial AD. So you're actually going to lose the scaling of a 3-star on 5 AD, which I think is going to be somewhere along the lines of 15 or 20 AD, or between 15 and 20 AD in the late game. So she's actually losing between 15 and 20 AD in the late game, which is actually pretty insane. And Ziggs total mana down to 40, which is going to be interesting because we can actually play mana printer Ziggs, kind of. I'll talk about kind of in a minute. Yasuo getting a buff, and Yasuo's mana getting nerfed. Sorry, buffed as well, reducing his mana, which is cool because I actually saw a Bang Bros comp yesterday and it worked out really well. So I'm thinking Bang Bros is probably still fine. Karma attack bonus. People on shield. So Karma's getting buffed and Syndra's getting buffed. So maybe we see a return of classic Egirls, because obviously with the Chalice changes, maybe we just see Egirls kind of return, especially if you're going for a level 3 Syndra. That would be pretty good. Kayle Divine Ascent Waves damage. So Kayle 3 is getting nerfed, but I wouldn't say by a significant amount. It's also Kayle 3. Most people don't get that, so it's irrelevant for most people, but it is relevant for if you're wanting to get the first... get a first place with the Kayle build, because often you need first place to get Kayle 3, basically. Vel'Koz is getting buffed, specifically at level 2 by 50 damage. So this means the Void Printer, and I still think Mana Printer like Laser is still going to be good. Void Brawlers might still be good as well. Wukong's Cyclone targeting now prioritizes hitting the closest enemy he hasn't yet hit rather than a random one. Cool. I think he kind of hit most people anyway, but that's still a nice little change. Chalice of Harmony, mana restore from 10 to 8, which means Sona is, if you get the perfect Chalice items for Sona, she's going to have to hit once if you're running 2 Chalices. Now you can actually run double Seraphs and a Chalice, but you will reduce the amount of mana that you're giving to everybody else, but she will still constantly cast and heal. Deathblade starting stacks up to 1, trying to make this item relevant. And Morello and Red Buff damage burn down by 2% over 10 seconds. You won't feel the hit too much. It's still a significant... They're still very, very good items. Red Buff especially, for Brawler Blaster, but they are nerfs to Kai'Sa, who really uses Morellos quite effectively, and it's a nerf to Brawler Blaster generally, like tiny amount. But honestly, I would say overall, the only builds that got hit here are Shredder, Poppy, and Mech, and I think everything else still remains very good. Yes, okay, tier 3 Kayle, but not many people get level 3 Kayle in the Kayle Chrono comp, right? And you would almost argue that the Wukong buff change might actually be good for the Kayle carry comp. I don't know if Karma is going to be enough to make Dark Star work, but I think Egirls could see a comeback. We could see some Mana Printer Ziggs comps for sure, or just double Seraph Ziggs in a Rebel comp, for instance, which I think would be pretty funny. Double Seraph Rebels, Seraph Rebels. I can't say it. Ziggs, which would be hilarious. I also think Bang Bros could make a comeback, because I genuinely do think that that the changes to Yasuo are pretty significant. Like he's going to get a significant amount more health in the late game with a 100 health buff. That's actually pretty solid. So yeah, so I would say we're going to go through all the comps as we usually do, but I would say that Brawler Blaster is still very good. Kayle Chrono is still very good. I do think that Poppy and Xayah are still playable. They just won't be as overpowered, which would be nice. So yeah, those are the patch notes. So as with every patch, I like to go through a tier list. This time I'm going to structure it a bit differently from the way I usually structure it. I'm just going to turn the lights because I look a bit weird. I'm going to structure it a little bit differently to the way that I usually structure it, okay? As you can see, I've just put on screen a couple of the screenshots of the games that I've had today. I hit Master Tier again. Thankfully, I've just been slowly improving and getting better at the game. And I finally feel comfortable that I can push for Grandmaster and Challenger now, especially on this patch because it's changed a lot. What I will say is I'm going to go through the builds that I think are ranging from S to C tier with the focus on consistency of top 2, top 3, okay? Not a build that's going to get you first place every time, but the consistency of a build and how well it's going to serve you in the meta if this is the build that you're trying to force a lot of the time. I think that there are a couple of really strong builds on this update, but I think probably the most prominent and most consistent is going to be Kayle carry. And this is essentially a 4 Chrono Kayle build, which you've probably seen a lot of. What we're going to do is we're just going to build the comp, and then I'm not going to talk about the early game, mid game, because that will require a specific video, which I actually have got coming tomorrow, a Kayle carry comp, because I think it's going to be one of the strongest. But I'm just going to talk about the items on Kayle and the units that you need, okay? So you're going to want Kayle, obviously. Kayle's important. You will actually need, at least the best option that you're going to get for a Blade Master is going to be Xayah. You're going to need your 4 Chrono. Now, the 4 Chrono that you want to use in the end game, and again, I'm talking about end game as a priority here, is Shen, because this gives you the 3 Blade Master. You really want Kayle to be 2-star as well. Then you're going to want your Thresh. Thresh is really good. He's a really, really insane addition. You're going to want... We've got 1, 2 here. We want Ezreal, don't we? We want Ezreal. We want Misfortune to give us the Valkyrie and the Blaster. We want our last Chrono, which is Wukong, okay? So it ends up looking something like this, right? This is the 4 Chrono. This is level 7, okay? You then want to add a Kassadin because that gives you Mana Reaver and also... it gives you Mana Reaver as well. So this is going to give you your overall composition. And on your bench, you want stuff like Lulu. Then when I get to level 9, I often end up just adding Lulu in, okay? Because Lulu's just a really, really good addition. But essentially, you just want to add things that are going to be good for your comp as a whole. Itemization for Kayle, which is the most important. I like GA or any kind of defensive item. Trapclaw, not so much. But Quicksilver and GA, I think, are really good. Then we want Gwynsu's Rageblade and... Hand of Justice. This is a really, really, really good setup for Kayle carry, okay? That's like one of the best setups you can have. Other items that work really well are like Rapid Fire Cannon and stuff. And then Misfortune is just going to get your other items. So I like to give Misfortune sometimes like this, anything like that. A QSS is really nice for Misfortune in the corner, or a Trapclaw or whatever. I just like to give her any kind of items. But essentially Misfortune just acts as your secondary carry in this respect. Something that I've really found was good for this build in particular is actually redemptions, because the longer that you keep your Kayle carry there live, the better. And I found that redemptions have worked really well, especially as you get into the later game, where if your front line dies and your Kayle's already taken some damage, she gets revived, you know, her health gets buffed up a little bit more. So this is what I think would be the best, one of the best comps on this meta. I think it sits in the very consistent tier. So the next comp that I think is going to be one of the most consistent on this update is Brawler Blaster, and its many variants. There are lots of different variants of Brawler Blaster, but this is the most common: 4 Brawlers, 4 Blasters. I've seen 2 Brawlers, 4 Blasters, Rebels, blah 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 blah. But essentially, this is the level 8 comp. I'm showing you the level 8 comp because it's kind of the closest. Most people won't actually get to level 9 in a build. The reason I have Malphite in the back corner here is that he's usually Blitzcrank bait. Especially if I can get a QSS for my Misfortune, which is really nice. I usually just leave my Malphite as Blitzcrank bait because like these 2 guys are really useful. Oh, obviously you want red buff on your Ezreal as well if you can. So I've talked a lot about Brawler Blasters on my channel, but I think Brawler Blasters are one of the most consistent comps, or at least will be one of the most consistent comps in the current meta. So I think going for Brawler Blaster is always going to be a really, really good thing. I think Brawler Blaster will be insane. Double Giant Slayer I think is best in slot on Jinx. However, another version of the Jinx build that I like to play as well is the Infinity Edge and the Last Whisper. If you're going up against lots of... if you're going up against lots of Vanguards, or kind of like any kind of Vanguard frontline, or lots of armor, or Bramble Vest, Infinity Edge Last Whisper works really nicely too. But I think Double Giant Slayer is just best in slot because it works so well with blasters. But this is also another very, very good Jinx build that you can play. So I think like Kayle carry and Brawler Blasters are like probably the most consistent comps in the meta right now. Now I'm going to talk about the comps that are slightly less, but still very good. To the surprise of some people, Shredder is actually still insanely powerful with the right items. I think you do need to have like the best in slot items for this to be a top 1 or even top 3 composition. But from all of my games today, people who have gone Shredder and have hit the right items have generally done very, very well. So I think with the right items, Shredder is very, very solid. especially because it scales so well with items as well. But yeah, I think Shredder is still a really, really, really good build. I like this variant of it the best because you get the Mana Reaver. I know people like to play the Fiora version, but I actually just prefer Aurelia because I think Mana Reaver is just better. But yeah, this is the version of Shredder. I still think it's very good. I think Shredder is still an insanely strong build. The 5 AD nerf to Xayah does not matter a huge amount, and I still think that this is going to be a super hard build to deal with. But I think it's probably one of the only hyper roll builds that is good enough to do well. I don't think the Candyland Poppy build is as good, but I think Shredder is still going to be consistent. I still think you're going to place okay with Shredder. It's definitely a build that will still work in the current meta. The 5 AD nerf was, I don't think, enough to hit Shredder hard. I don't think it's going to be as consistent as some of the top tier comps like Brawler Blaster or Kayle Carry, but I still think Shredder is going to be very good. And the reason I don't think it's as consistent is because you do need to hit the perfect items on Xayah. I think if you get anything less than this, or with Trap Claw over QSS, but anything less than this, I think you're struggling. So I think you need the perfect items on Xayah to make this work. The next build that I think's going a little bit overlooked in the current meta is the Slam Jam. I genuinely think the Slam Jam is pretty solid right now, and I think it's just generally in a good spot. I like this particular setup on Darius, but I do think you need to add some extra critical strike to make this work. Honestly, double Rabadons for me is like insane. And then you just kind of add whatever, really. Darius just does well with AP items. So I've seen people play Ionic Spark, Rabadons, Jeweled Gauntlet. Anything that uses AP is usually going to be good for Darius. Then for Jace, he usually gets like super defensive items, like you give him the Bramble Vest, you give him the Dragon's Claw, and then you can slap something like Ionic on him as well. It's really good. Anything extra just goes across the board, like any extra over to Kassadin. You could sometimes give a Shojin's over to Ashe, but yeah, or Shojin's rather over to Rakan. But essentially, Slam Jam, Space Jam, still a really, really, really good build. I don't think it should be overlooked. I think Space Jam is in a good spot, especially with the fact that the hyper roll comps have kind of been nerfed a little bit. You're not going to get rolled over when you're slow rolling. I think it's one of the few slow roll comps that are still really strong right now, and I think Space Jam is definitely a build that can net you a top 3 finish with the right items on the Darius. Nothing really changed about it. The meta just favors it a bit more now because with some of the hyper roll builds slowing down, you're going to have more time to slow roll. So I think Space Jam is super good, and the point of Space Jam is just for your Darius to dunk on people and hit them, and then just keep resetting and keep resetting and keep resetting. It does require like Darius 3-star, Jace 3-star, Kassadin 3-star, Rakan and Xin Zhao 3-star, Ashe if you can get her, but don't worry about Ashe. Ashe is like the lowest priority, but so it is quite a hard build to get. But usually there's only one person going for it in a lobby most of the time. And so that does mean that you're probably in an okay spot. I forgot to share the majority of the builds so far, so I'll have to do that. But yeah, so I think Space Jam's good. Another build that I think is going to be really good on the current patch, but it's going to be a little bit less consistent than Kayle and a little bit less consistent than Brawler Blaster is Cybernetics. Cybernetics are obviously in a great space. When it comes to the units that you're using, obviously, this is good. If you get Infiltrator Talons, you can put them on Aurelia over something like a Last Whisper or one of your Infinity Edges. But essentially, this is a really, really, really good comp, especially in the late game. If you can 3-star Aurelia, that's insane. And obviously, what you're looking to do with this comp is win streak, because the problem is it's not consistent is because you need Echo. So obviously Echo doesn't always show up, so if you don't get Echo, sometimes this can fall a bit flat. But if you do get to the late game, it's really, really strong. You've got 3 Blade Masters, you've got 6 Cybernetics, and you have the Mana Reaver. If you're going to level 9, you can add in something like a Misfortune just to give yourself the extra, or you can add in Lulu so for the Celestial bonus. There's lots of things that you can add at level 9 basically, but this would be your core, and then you just work with this until you find the level 9 if you're going for it. And actually you can replace Thresh for Kassadin, obviously, and Kassadin can be used for the Mana Reaver, and obviously, like I said, Celestial if you add Lulu. So I think Cybernetics is going to be really good, just a little bit less consistent than Brawler Blaster and also Chrono Kayle, because again, when any comp relies on a legendary, it's a little bit less consistent in general, and especially with cybernetics, you often need to win streak to make it work, so it can be a bit awkward. But yeah, this is this is a good build, and I think it's pretty strong. You could get rid of the Thresh for the Misfortune to give you the Blaster bonus for your Lucian, which is good, or you can add Nezreal in and then a Thresh afterwards for the Chrono buff. But yeah, this is just generally a pretty solid comp right now, and obviously you're going to want individual items on all of your cybernetics. Honestly, Echo can have quite a lot on him. I've seen people do Morellos. I've seen people do red buff. Echo can have pretty much anything. He basically takes the rest of your items, but Irelia is your main carry. Irelia will be doing the majority of your work. So this is cybernetics. So interestingly enough, I don't think like complete Chalice builds are dead. I don't want to include them in the list because I'm not sure. I haven't tested them myself, so it's really difficult to tell. But one thing that I think, and this is going to be more, I know I've been showing the builds outright, but I think something that we're going to start to see come back is classic Void Brawler, because Vel'Koz got a buff, and then obviously we want Cho'Gath. So what I'm thinking, right, what I'm thinking about classic Void Brawlers, you just have the classic, the Brawler setup, right? You have the Blitzcrank, you have the Vi, and you have the Malphite for the voids, and then you want to have sorcerers, right? So usually a good sorcerer to add is Twisted Fate because it gives you the chrono. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 units on now, and then basically you work up to 9. And I think go for 4 sorcerers. So this is the classic Void Brawler. You don't even need to have all the brawlers. You can actually just have 2 if you want, and then go for more sorcerers. So you can actually cut Malphite and Vi, for instance, or Malphite and Blitzcrank, and go for 4 sorcerers instead, which I think is also good. What I'm trying to work out right now is how good is, so you're a 4-tier investment for you have a 4-tier investment for Sona. If I were to just add 2 Seraphs to my Vel'Koz for a 4-tier investment, would that be any better or worse than straight up just having the Sona build? Because if I just did 2 Seraphs on my Vel'Koz and then added anything, something like either a Dual Gauntlet or a Rabadon's Death Cap, is this any better or worse than what I had previously? Because actually, I think you're probably going to be getting casting from the Vel'Koz just about as much as you did before. And the fact is that Sona now needs to basic attack, even if you give her 2 Chalices and a Seraphs, Sona now needs to basic attack every time to get the mana. So would it just be worth giving straight up 40 mana back to Vel'Koz so that he can cast pretty quickly afterwards? Or should you just go 2 Seraphs and a Chalice on Sona, but you need more tiers to make that happen, and it's a little bit harder to make work? So this is a good question, and it raises an interesting point. Do we think that classic Squid, so classic Void Brawler, is going to be better than just the Chalice Sona? Because obviously now Sona's not going to be able to cast continuously. People still succeeded with like Sona with just a Seraphs and a Chalice, right? People still succeeded. So I think arguably Void Brawler is it's going to swing either way, right? So I think you could even just say, all right, well, to be honest with you, I could still play the Sona version and it'd still be okay. And I still think the Sona version will be okay, by the way. I think you end up just having this and a Chalice. Something like you end up just having something like, so if you can't get the full build, that's fine. Double Seraph's Chalice is great because you're going to hit the same Sona that you had previously, because you're just going to instantly give yourself 40 mana every time you cast. But I actually don't think the Sona build is even that bad. I still think the Sona build is going to be completely fine. So I think you can still play this consistently, and you can switch it between just classic Void Brawler with a Seraphs or double Seraphs on your Vel'Koz, or you can play the Sona version, which is also really good. Okay, now time to talk about the Nuclear Gangplank composition. This is in B+ tier because it's an insane comp if you can get it to work, but you need Gangplank, and Gangplank 2 makes this much, much better. This comp's incredibly good, but again, it is not consistent enough because you need the Gangplank, and you need Gangplank 2. If you don't hit Gangplank, you basically lose. But I do think the Nuclear Gangplank composition is worthy of being on the list, because I think it's a great composition. 6 Sorks Gangplank. I generally think that there's going to be a lot of either classic Void Brawler. I genuinely think classic Egirl could come back into the meta as well, just because the Syndra buffs might actually make her pretty strong. So I think we might see a move away from Chalice-centered Sona builds, because now I think that's going to be too slow. I think that the Chalice Sona might just be too slow. But overall, I think this is a good composition. It's just not consistent enough to be considered a high tier comp, because if you don't hit your GP, you're just going to lose. If you hit your GP, you can usually get top 3. If you don't hit your GP, you're just going to lose. That's basically how it goes. Now we're going to talk about Rebels. Rebels are an interesting one. They aren't very consistent, and they require quite a lot of legendaries to work really well. Like, the ultimate Rebel composition is if you have a Demolition Aurelion Soul, and then you have a Gangplank with a GA and a Rabadons, and then essentially Jinx takes anything else that you can get realistically, which would be like things like if you can get a Giant Slayer, great. If you can get a red buff, also great. And then that's level 7. And then at level 8, you'd want to add something like a Misfortune or just any kind of blaster, realistically. But that's like the ultimate Rebels comp. I just don't think Rebels are consistent enough, and I think Brawler Blaster is more consistent. Now, here's a bit of theory crafting. Yasuo got buffed, and Master Yi is still very good. I think that you could. I'm going to share this one first, but then we're going to add a little. We're going to tag a little extra on. I think that Rebels are probably. Okay, so this is classic Egirls, okay? I genuinely do think that with the Syndra buffs, if you can get her to 3, it could genuinely be pretty solid. I think you're going to need, like, 2 Seraphs or Seraph's Chalice or whatever, but I think 2 Seraphs is probably a good start. 2 Seraphs would be really good, and then just add something like a Rabadons to her. Maybe not even Rabadons, maybe like a Jeweled Gauntlet or something like that. But let's just say that 2 Seraphs and maybe a Trap Claw to start, right? And then you want to have the Morello, like Bramble Vest, that kind of stuff, GA or whatever on your Nico. You want it to look something like this. I think this is worth trying. I think with the Syndra buffs, no one's going Syndra. You might be able to get her to 3-star. And she does a lot of damage at 3-star now. She has just been buffed on the current meta. Obviously, E-Girls haven't been, or rather Star Guardians at 6 haven't been changed, so it's still a lower mana value. But you can go like Ari Chalice, for instance. Like Ari Chalice in E-Girls or whatever, and I think it can work. I genuinely think it could work. So I want to try it out. I'm going to put it down in B plus tier. I think it's probably good enough to go in B plus tier. So we're going to try it out. I'm actually going to try it on this current meta as well and see how it goes. So this is actually a build that has been gaining popularity again, and I would recommend having a look at it if you can. This is obviously just Darkstar. I had someone in the game today play Darkstar, and it went very, very well. Like, Darkstar just went very well for them. So I'm kind of putting it in there as something to think about, because I think it's something that is worth thinking about if you can do it. Darkstar is pretty solid. And I don't think it's like, I think you need to get like a 3-star Jhin, or you need your 2-star, well, I put that on Karma for, you need your 2-star Xerath to really pop off. But it is a build worth looking at, and I think it's a build that can function still very well in the meta, and I do think it's a little bit overlooked at times. I think the Shaco is a bit of a bait. I think you have to play for Jhin, and you have to get Jhin on as early as possible, and you're still using Mordekaiser and Jarvan just to die quickly. But I do think this is a pretty solid build that gets overlooked sometimes, so definitely think about it, because I recently, and you're going to see the video that I put out tomorrow, I lost to I won against a Darkstar comp, but Darkstar got second. So that's Darkstar still doing very well, as long as it's set up correctly. It is a build that you need to win streak into, so I'm going to have a video coming out this week about how to win streak and what comps to look to play in the early game. But Darkstar is still something that you can transition into well, and I think it still works nicely. Okay guys, Candyland. Is it still good? Yes, it's still okay. Like, it's just not as broken as it once was. You can still play Candyland and expect with the right items to do well. You do have to focus on getting to the 6th Sorcerer. You can't constantly roll down looking for Poppies and Zoes and Twisted Fates anymore. So once you make your first roll down, that usually is going to decide whether this comp is worth going. It's a big risk. It is a risk to go for Candyland now. It's definitely not as strong as it once was, but Candyland is still decent. I would put it in the same tier as things like Rebels or E-Girls. I think it's B+. I think Shredder is still very good. I think Candyland is still not as good. But I think, you can play with Ionic Spark, which I think is decent. I think you can play with Rabadon's Death Cap now as well. But Poppy still becomes quite difficult to kill versus the right compositions. So I do think that in general, this composition is very good. I forgot the Wukong, of course. But in general, this composition is still fine. You should still look to play it if you want to, but it's not as broken as it once was. It also means less people are going to be going for it, likely. So if you go for it, you might be less contested. Again, like I said, I actually think Zoe is a higher priority for 3-starring than Twisted Fate now, because she still has a 4-second stun at level 3. So prioritizing Zoe and Poppy Twisted Fate level 3 got nerfed pretty heavily. He's still good, but I think it's fine to have him at level 2. And if you have him at level 2, you can put your Morellos on your like Vel'Koz, for instance. However, like I said, the comp is still perfectly fine and can still work. So don't write it off completely. It's still an okay comp. It's just not as good as it once was. Alright, classic Bang Bros. Yasuo just got buffed. I think people massively underrated this. I do genuinely think classic Bang Bros are probably still good, especially now slow rolling is okay because the hyper roll meta is kind of disappearing a little bit. I think classic Bang Bros are not like insane, but I think classic Bang Bros are probably good enough to play. I would love to hear how you guys think about it with testing. I've put them down in the B tier, because I don't think they're going to be like insanely good. I could be completely wrong, but with the Yasuo buffs, it might be enough to make Bang Bros relevant, and I think it's worth testing. I put the experimental Rebel Bang Bros comp down at the bottom. I don't know how well that will work, but I've put it down as an experimental. So yeah, feel free to test this out and let me know how it goes. I would love to. I would actually love to hear. So I actually played this earlier today, Vanguard Sniper. It's not a top 1 comp. There are a couple of ways you can look for a top 1 if you get a Jin 3 or a Wukong 3, for instance. Those can actually carry you. Like Wukong 3 is like actually crazy powerful. I've got a video coming out tomorrow where you see it. Wukong 3 is actually crazy powerful. But I did play a game of it today where I got 3-star Mordekaiser, and it didn't do bad. It still struggles, and I think you need a Runan's Hurricane to really make it work on Jin. But it didn't do bad, it just wasn't as good, you know, as a lot of the other comps in the meta. It's pretty consistent though, and I think you can probably find Vanguards, and with Shredder being a little bit less popular, although I still think Shredder is very good, less people will be playing like Last Whisper orientated builds, I feel. So I think Vanguards in general are going to be a bit tankier at the front line. So Vanguard Sniper, definitely look at it. It's something that I often go, if I go for an IE star and I don't get the cybernetics, for instance, or I don't get, or too many people are going Blaster Brawlers, Vanguard Sniper is a comp I will default into. I think it's good. It's not a game-winning comp, but it's a good top 4 comp. And if you just want to get a good placement and you think you've screwed your game from the early start, then I think this is a solid thing to look to play. I think classic protectors are also okay. The problem with classic protectors is that they don't have enough damage to get through front lines, and that creates a problem because classic protectors are supposed to be able to endure damage, right? That's the point of classic protectors. But versus things like GP versus Void Brawlers, like almost anything, right? They just suck. Like they just can't survive long enough. So they're good, like in the sense that they're C tier. If you really can't go for anything, classic protectors can be okay. But I do genuinely believe that they're not that good. Also, I think it should be actually Dragon's Claw on Xin. I don't think it matters if he gets CC'd as long as he's surviving. And also the problem with protectors is if you're gonna go for a protector-based comp with Rakan and Xin Zhao, you should just probably be playing Space Jam, because Space Jam's just better and it can actually kill things, whereas this can't actually kill anything, and that's the problem with classic protectors. It's not as good. I'm putting it in because it's there. It's the same with Mech Infiltrator. I think Mech Infiltrator is bad. I genuinely think Mech Infiltrator is really bad on this update, but people will still play it, and if you get the right items and you're ahead of the curve, you can still get wins with it, right? Speaking of Mech Infiltrator, we should probably talk about that. So speaking of Mech Infiltrator, I think you can still play it, but you need to like perfect item it, and I think you need demo spat to even have a chance of doing well with Mech Infiltrator. I think Mech Infiltrator will be a C tier composition. Like I think you can go it, and I think it might be able to get you a top 4, but it's not going to be a top 1 comp anymore. It's just not going to be the case. You've lost like 30% of your AD in the late game, especially from your mech, which is insane. I think you need 3-star Shaka, you need 3-star Kai'Sa. I think they're both important to actually get a win. And even then, you probably need to go to level 7 and add Lux or add Kayle. And I think you need the perfect items on Kai'Sa as well. I just think this comp is not going to be as strong as it once was, and I think it's probably a C tier comp at best, unfortunately. But that is what it is.